Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the Voice of Reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And making headlines in terms of what is happening right now inside of the battlescape. It is reported that over the last 24 hours, Russian forces have attacked the city of Zaporizhia with both cruise missiles and a variety of drone systems. Additionally, Russian forces have hit targets in and around and south of Kiev with dozens of drone systems being reported utilized. But again, right now, we continue to see a very large buildup by the Russian Federation directed towards possible future operations against Ukraine. Specifically, we have seen the deployment of T-55-54 tanks. These tanks have been observed on railways, allegedly heading towards the Ukrainian front lines. Now, are those tanks going to be used by the Ukrainians, or could these tanks that we see being deployed inside of Russia, is it possible that they are being sent to the aid of other Russian allies? The Russians still provide weapons and equipment to a variety of nation states around the world, and a variety of nation states continue to use the T-55-54. So I would hit the pause button to believe that the Russians are going to use those older tanks in this conflict. Is it possible? Yes, absolutely. A T-55-54 would be much better than, say, some sort of technical vehicle or an APC with a light machine gun. Now, with this continued buildup by the Russians, and what I would also say is a certain lack of large-scale maneuver operations by the Russians, it does appear that the Russians are preparing for something significant. And what I mean by significant, we are hearing reports that the Russians are amassing, on the low end, 300 to 500,000 troops, quite possibly an additional 2,000 to 3,000 tanks. And again, this buildup, and if this force is then used along the front lines in large-scale maneuver operations, we would not have seen anything comparable since maybe the World War II, but at the same time you have to look at the U.S. 1991 Gulf War campaign, where there was a very large, robust force assembled in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. But again, the preparation that is underway, compounding with the lack of high-tempoed operations by the Russians, lead one to believe that the Russians indeed are preparing for something massive in the coming weeks and months ahead. And again, most likely, we are going to see that operation take place in the summer. Things start to dry up. The Russians will then have the ability to maneuver, and again, quite possibly, we will see a massive onslaught of Russian forces being thrown against the Ukrainian lines. And I have to wonder at this point, given the situation, given the state of affairs between the West and Russia, if not Russia is preparing for something bigger than what it even had initially prepared for in the days and weeks leading up to this war. In all probability, there has to be, at this point, contingency plans inside of Russia for an all-out war scenario where you could quite possibly see the full conquest of Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to say that's going to happen, but given what is happening on the ground, and given the forward-thinking nature of the Kremlin in terms of what it perceives as threats going into the future, and not just a year, 2, 3 years, 10 years into the future, you have to wonder if the Kremlin has not made the decision for a full-out, all-encompassing invasion of Ukraine at a certain point. Now, are we seeing the buildup and the deployment of Russian forces that have the ability to do that as of yet? It's difficult to say. Things are difficult to read inside of Russia in terms of what exactly is going on the ground, but we do know that there is serious large-scale buildups. The military machine, the Russian military machine, the military-industrial complex is ramping up. We do know that the conscription and the drafting of soldiers continues well past that 300,000 person original allotment that the Kremlin had stated. So again, we're probably looking at double that number, if not triple that number, given the buildup that is going on. I mean, we are seeing corps being created, divisions being created. We're seeing training areas in Belarus and all across the Russian Federation currently being used for a massive military buildup, and eventually that's going to be utilized. And if the Russians perceive Ukraine is a threat it cannot live with, then in all probability, best case scenario, it's looking at a operation to seize all territory east of the Dnieper River, with contingency planning to go even further. Now, obviously, there was a recent meeting between Chinese leadership and Russian leadership, and it's glaringly apparent that the Russian Federation is going to receive the full support in terms of the production of weapons and equipment, and those weapons and equipment will be transferred to Russia. Without a doubt, that is going to be the manufacturing assistance that I believe the Chinese are going to render to the Russians at this point. If you listen to the rhetoric coming from China, if you see what's happening between those two nation states, everything points in a direction that the Chinese are going to directly assist the Russians in this ongoing war effort. Now, with that being said, you also have to look at the assistance that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States, has provided to the Ukrainians. Now, I think what's important is to just take a look at, for instance, just one category of assistance that the United States is providing, and that is ammunition. So it's reported now that the United States may have supplied the Ukrainians with upwards to 1 million rounds of 155 millimeter artillery shells. We know the United States has handed over 140 plus 155 millimeter tubed systems, and then obviously more of those 155 guns have been delivered by other nation states as well. So we can count well over 10 battalions of heavy 155 millimeter guns have been transferred over to the Ukrainians. Additionally, the United States has delivered 100 million rounds of small arms. 100 million rounds. 6,000 precision-guided 155 millimeter rounds. 10,000 155 millimeter remote anti-armor mine systems. 100,000 rounds of 125 millimeter tank ammunition. So the West is essentially handing over some of the former Eastern Bloc tank ammunition depots that have been stored and handing those over to the Ukraine, and even in some cases producing those rounds. 45,000 152 millimeter rounds, 20,000 122 millimeter rounds, 50,000 122 millimeter Grad rockets, 370,000 105 millimeter artillery rounds, 545,000, let's just say 500,000 rounds of 25 millimeter ammunition. And the list goes on and on and on. And truly, we are hearing reports from inside of here, the United States, that vast stockpiles of what the United States had in preparations for a future major conflict are being handed over to the Ukrainians. So it's interesting to watch how this continues, and obviously I believe the Chinese are going to do the same in terms of its assistance directed towards Russia as well. We may not see actual weapon systems being handed over, but I would imagine that the parts and equipment to create weapon systems, optics, and then obviously ammunition is definitely going to be handed over by the Chinese at some point, if that has not already been done. But again, we continue to watch the front lines very, very closely. Continued fighting along the eastern Donbass front, Bakhmut, east of Seversk, south of Bakhmut. The Avdiivka pocket continues. And then again, these Russian ballistic missile strikes continue against, and cruise missile strikes against Ukrainian targets, against those very depots of Western ammunition and munitions that have been sent to Ukraine. So again, as the summer approaches, again, I would not be surprised if we see something very large and very, very ominous occur in eastern Ukraine, or possibly someplace else along the border of Ukraine as well, given the magnitude of this continued Russian buildup. So we'll continue to monitor, report. Thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.